board. I'm happy to be presenting to you some draft goals and strategies after last week's meeting. A survey was sent out to board members to elicit your feedback about what you might think to be the most important goals and strategies, as well as what you might think might be the least important goals and strategies. Often harder to actually pinpoint least important. Everything seems important. So we appreciate your feedback. We did the same exercise with staff members and we got their feedback. At this point, I will invite you to make any observations or questions that you might have about the survey. If you don't have any, I'm happy to go into kind of what we're proposing as our draft goals and strategies.
How do we do to get recognized? As Charmin, or we're gonna raise hands or what?
Sure, you can just chime in would be fine. Thank you.
I mean, I read that survey and I agree with the comment made by, I forget his name, that is not able to make it, that I find it hard to see how a board that typically is always 100% in agreement, that we have so much all over the place. But one of the ones that I found interesting, and I would like to better understand, and whoever did this says least important and not as important to the board, which I disagree, which has to do with training and staff development. Is it really that it's not important to the board, or is the perception that a lot of that already goes on and therefore there's not a lot of work to be done? Because the nice thing about surveys is it gives you some feedback, right? The bad thing about it is it could be misleading if you don't understand what it's telling you.
Ted, you want to take that?
Yeah, surely. I think it's the reason why these items even made the list is that a significant number of people thought it would be worth considering as a major priority. But even as we talked last week, since it is likely impossible for CHFA to take on everything, at least all at once, what we're really trying to figure out is which of these things should gain the most attention right now. It is not to suggest that these other things are unimportant, but to put them in some priority order. We asked two different kinds of questions. What are those priorities that you think are most important? And what are those priorities that are least important? They're still priorities, but they are not as urgent, they're not as demanding as these other ones might be. Does that help?
It does, but I think what was missing in the survey, and I guess there's nothing we can do about it now, right? Is why do you think it's least important? Is it because you think we're doing a good job on it? So if you give me 4 things to pick from, right? And I think they're all important, but then I have to rank them most important, least important. I'm going to rank least important the one that I think we're doing the best on because I don't have to do a lot of work on it, right?
Yeah.
Not because I don't think it's important. That's all. That's one of the limitations of surveys, right? Depending how you do it.
Well, and it's really why you don't want to make decisions uniquely by survey, which is why we come back together and we talk. So, for example,
well, that's why we're having this conversation.
Exactly. On that particular question, you noted that some members of the staff actually said it's a very important priority. Actually, other members of the staff didn't think it was such a priority, so there needs to even be a staff conversation. What is it we mean by this? So it's a worthy conversation, but there's a significant number of staff members, and I would say those I've been speaking to at the management level who feel as though the kind of changes that we might want to take on will require additional investment in professional development. Not to say it's not good today, it's just going to need to be more, maybe different than what we've had in the past. Anthony, how would you respond to that?
No, I agree with you. I have nothing to add. I think surveys are not the be all and the end all, and we've tried to to map out a process that we think, captures more than just what the survey has conveyed. So I appreciate the feedback, but the survey is not going to be everything. It's one way we can assess priority. So having said that, I'm going to launch into the document. Cheryl, would you like to share your screen, please, with the draft goals and strategies? Thank you. So we wanted to lay out some key policy priorities for the board to consider as it's evaluating how to move forward with the strategic plan. We've laid out 5 or 6 policy priorities. If you don't mind scrolling down a little bit, Cheryl, on the page. Thank you. So, yeah, okay, thank you. So we think that these are going to be the hallmarks of any and all of our activities over the next 3 years. Of course, these are just draft forms, so invite your comments and your feedback. So the first one is identifying additional funding sources besides CHFA funding, and using not only funding partnerships, but exploring opportunities to partner with other entities, other governmental entities, private, public, the whole gamut. That seemed really, really important to try to accomplish in the next 3 years. Determine cost and merit of taking more risk in financing activities. We talked a lot about that. The board wanted to see an analysis done of kind of where CHFA stands today and where it's projected to go over the next 3 to 5 years, and understanding what the cost benefit analysis looks like for CHFA to be taking more risk, and what does that risk look like. Exploring ways to expand housing choices for those living in low opportunity areas. A lot of discussion went into this area, into this particular topic around urban versus non-urban development. The board seemed fairly evenly split, although marginally in the direction of continuing with urban development. There was the feeling that you couldn't really make a choice, that you had to really do both, and that we had to revitalize urban neighborhoods, but that CHFA was not the only partner in that endeavor. What we have here is an effort to try to get to where we think you were going, but obviously feel free to chime in. We think that CHFA needs to be promoting more housing choices for the residents of the state. Housing is a predictor in many ways and has a strong correlation with good health and financial outcomes for people. So for people who live in lower opportunity areas, specifically, you know, there may be ways that CHFA could be using its resources to balance redeveloping urban areas, preserving units that are restricted for the long term, as well as creating units in a way that is sustainable and is strategic in terms of its location, with access to transit and you know, economic opportunity. Helping first-time homeowners build wealth. This was brought up as a point in terms of homeowners. Generally, real estate has been a very important wealth building tool in the toolkits of most Americans who own homes. And how can we do that for more and more residents of our state? Again, as I mentioned earlier, using our strategies in a way that allows us to target areas that are near transit and harness educational and economic opportunities, as well as taking the work we do beyond the norm of business as usual, but using every tool we have in our toolkit to advance our mission and our work. So with that, I will stop and ask for any comments.
Tim, and I mentioned this when you and I, this is George, when
Yes.
you and I spoke. I mean, when it comes to identify additional funding source,
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are a lot of different types of funding sources out there. I think the goal should be more to how we leverage those different funding sources to work with a common mission. What do I mean by that? If we want to create more home ownership in the cities, then we should reward that behavior, right? And we should reward that behavior by helping more of entities coming together towards that goal. And what do I mean by that? Meaning, not only either we will fund more money or make it easier for you to get the money, but only if there is a comprehensive social service component to it also that's going to help people on job training, that's going to help people with wealth management, versus that we only focus on the cost per unit or building the house or the apartment, if I'm making sense.
I think I get where you're going. Would you like us to take a stab at reframing that first policy priority to address your concerns?
No, I would like to have a discussion about it because I'm one of how many board members we have. You know, and I'm saying if we're going to come out with a policy or a priority as a board, it should not be because George Perez wants it or because Mickey Mouse wants it or Donald Duck. What I'm trying to do is initiate a discussion on it or feedback on it.
So these are policy priorities. When we get to the strategies and program development, that's where I think your ideas will really
Yeah, but
be.
one is contingent on the other, right? Is our priority to identify additional funding or to leverage the funding that's there right now?
I would say both. I would
I
say,
suggest it's both and.
yeah.
The same way I would like to have I would like to have the apple and also eat it.
Well, there's different kinds, this is Heidi. We can leverage the balance sheet that already exists or we can go out and find additional funding sources. I think there's multiple, and someone said it, whether it was Nandini, there's multiple ways to obtain financing inside using the internal, the balance sheet, and external. So I think it's just a more complicated question. But I think that the premise is correct. We want to be able to provide more units, and in order to do that, we need more funding, period.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is the priority should be, this is the ideal situation. We want to develop housing, right? And part of that component, we want to have transit, we want to have renewable energy, we want to have job training. What is it that we think is an ideal setting, right? And those projects or developers or groups or whatever you want to call them, that brings all that together is the one that's going to get the favorable treatment and financing. And that is leveraging different people, different partners, different funding sources, versus saying we just want to fund multifamily or single family or whatever it is that we want to fund, and only focus in the one little part of the puzzle that we control. Food for thought.
Why
I
don't we?
like the way that George put that. I'm sorry, this is Lisa. I like the way that George put that, in that there's an opportunity to think more comprehensively about the type of investments that CHFA makes and how those fit into larger ideas of what's needed in our communities.
Yeah.
I think, George, that's what you were getting at, and I think that's really important.
Lisa, I couldn't have said it better myself, obviously.
So can we ask for a consensus about whether we should rewrite this policy priority, maybe to make it larger, more expansive, based on Commissioner Perez's comment? Happy to take a stab at it. I mean, I think we meant to be expansive, so we certainly don't want to be limited. That's not our intention at all. So, so happy to take a stab at that. If everyone's okay, we can move on.
Anthony, I think you can move on because those are important components. These are the priorities. And then when you look at the approach and how we're going to do this, so then we can address those. But those are points well taken, and you should keep track of those. So when we move on, as we move on, then we can add those.
Okay. Cheryl, please turn the page. Thank you. So we wanted to vision cast with the board as to how you imagine CHFA's mission. Of course, its mission is set by statute, so we really haven't changed our mission. We've reimagined our vision using more of an inclusive definition of the housing we build to include the communities that we build those housing in. So that's something that I think is different this particular year. I think it speaks to a larger context that CHFA is trying to work and do its, conduct its mission in. And also the values that will guide the work of CHFA staff and its board. So we talk about community. This is the community of employees, the community of board and staff, as well as the larger community, our partners and the citizens of the state of Connecticut. This is how we work, and this is the work we do, and we're not working in isolation. We're working in a community for the community. We're devoted to service. Service has many meanings. It can mean customer service, which is internal. It could also mean the customers we serve, as well as the customers, the ultimate customer, which is the renter or the homeowner. We're committed to excellence. We always want to be an innovative partner. We want to be a leader in the state when it comes to housing, and we're continuously looking to make that be a reality. We're engaged, I'm sorry, I can't see that, it's really small. I'm gonna see. We're energized by collaboration. We're not the only game in town. We need to work with others, and we will be looking for ways to create those relationships internally and externally. And finally, ownership. We value and take pride in our work, and we learn from, we use challenges as an opportunity to reframe how we look at problems. And we use those as vehicles for moving forward. I invite you to give me comments on this as well.
Hi, it's Jerry Abrahams.
Yeah.
I think this is, I understand that the mission is set by statute, but with respect to the values, I would just note that we don't mention anything about the environment here. And as a state agency, I would ask other board members to think about, should we include something with respect to environmental stewardship? I also say we don't mention anything about inclusion or diversity.
Yeah, this is Kylie. I want to just second the inclusion or diversity. And, I think there's a question as to whether that's a separate value or whether you incorporate that maybe into the vision. You mentioning higher opportunity or diverse communities located in sustainable and healthy communities, but also diverse communities with opportunity or something like that. But I think there needs to be some acknowledgement of the diversity and inclusion component, since a lot of the housing CHFA's building is primarily serving people of color.
And Nandini, and I think this is Selah, that in the driven by community, maybe is the space where you can incorporate something on those lines.
Sure. I like your ideas. Thank you very much.
And I think environment also probably can go in that same line, in that same category.
I would like clarification of what we mean by community, because different people may have different perception or understanding what that is. Is the city of New Haven a community, or is it the hill section of the city of New Haven, right? Who is the community?
Well, I think community could mean from the smallest definition and the most restrictive definition to a much broader definition. The idea of this value is not to create the idea that we're artificially restricting ourselves to certain communities. It's more inclusive. It's meant to be inclusive.
Okay, let me rephrase my question.
Okay.
As some of you may know, I was an elected official for almost 28 years. And I actually reached very high level of position in the city of New Haven. And I can tell you, when we had this kind of policy discussions, how should I put it without sounding that I'm being negative? We define communities differently than the communities itself define themselves sometimes, if you know what I mean. And we acted accordingly. So if we did a development in downtown or closer to Yale or closer to the East Rock, those developments may have a gym, may have other amenities that a development in New Hopeville or Fairhaven or the Hill may not have, including job training, parks, whether you had a health facility in the building or not. You see the point I'm trying to make? So even within a city, how do we define community, right? And who do we listen to? Or who it is that we're trying to work with? Considering that in many cases, we're not the ones that do the grassroots work on it, right? Is the nonprofit teaming up with the city who comes to us with a proposal. Or for profit developer.
If I may, I believe that's why the vision is going to be very important as well. The clause in the reimagined vision of locating housing in sustainable and healthy communities is pretty important. And what we heard consistently in the research that we did is that we can't just measure our success by the number of units we help to finance or help to create, but ultimately, what's the impact on community? And the community could be the constellation of units that you've created. It could be the neighborhood in which it is located. It could be in the city or town in which it is located. It could be in the state in which it is located. As you say, community can be defined in multiple ways, but we should take upon our work in a style that would help us to understand the potential impact on community at all of those levels. If I understood what people were trying to tell us.
I guess I would observe that the community value, to the commissioner's point, is somewhat ill-defined. And again, going back to where we sort of started the discussion, I would rather, and again, I'll speak for myself and defer to the other board members, but I would rather see, since, at least in my mind, I think I'd like to see the organization value diversity and value environmental concerns as its own value. It's a specific value. If it's in fact really important to us and reflects the values of our organization. So, do we want to change the driven by community to be more specific to those values, because those are values, and I'm not sure, since communities is not, I'm not sure that's a value, that's a thing. Just something to think about, or I'll leave it to others to figure out how to wordsmith that.
If you want us to make that change, this is why we're having this conversation. So happy to consider.
We can take that and think about it.
Okay.
Have a little more thoughts, and so that you can move on.
Okay.
Okay. I just want to second that. I like that, splitting those two things out.
Okay. Oh, somebody's speaking, but they're breaking up.
Sarah, we cannot hear you.
Oh dear.
Maybe Sarah, maybe you can use the chat. We cannot hear you.
Okay. She said she'll get to us later.
Okay.
About half, I think, before we lose a couple board members, so we should try to get through most of this. So if you can move the page, Cheryl. Thank you. So in terms of our goals, we've listed 6 goals. And the first goal is to really, is an overarching goal to try to ensure that all of our programs now and the future are in alignment with the key policy priorities that we talked about at the beginning of the meeting. So, you know, I think the concern here is that, you know, we can have goals and we can have goals, but ultimately they're going to have to be guided by some higher level priorities set by the board. And so this would give us the umbrella, so to speak, to direct all of our work to be judged in a way under these key priorities, which is why the key priorities are really important to establishing a framework. So I just put this out there. If you think that this is not necessary, we can certainly revise it or remove it. But, you know, this was what the team thought would be, necessary in order for us to feel like we've kept our work in line with the things that the board would consider to be key. So, if there are any questions? If not, I'll move on.
So Nandini, why don't you go through all the goals and then you take
Sure, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So goal number 2, Cheryl, please, thank you. Goal 2 is really from the discussion last week about COVID and having a short-term goal that responded to COVID, because really the work's going to have to be now for the next 6 to 12 months. And so this was looking at how we can respond, including outreach and marketing related to our regular programs, that we run, maybe housing counseling or other things that we know will have immediate impacts on people. The third goal is, this is where we talked about having better tools to finance the creation and preservation of affordable housing. So we have 3 strategies. The third bullet should really go at the top, so I can fix that afterwards, but it's really talking about having a study, an analysis being performed to understand CHFA's current financial position to enable board and management to direct our investments and our risk-taking appropriately in the future. Finding ways to better leverage our funds, either through exploring alternate sources of funding and alternate executions. And finally, creating more products, not necessarily more is better, but different products to meet different needs at either this time during COVID or even in the future. Enabling refinancing on seasoned multifamily mortgages, portfolios that need to be rehabbed, something that traditionally CHFA has not had much success with. Offering single family refinance for the purposes of providing a lower rate or relief from accruals due to COVID hardships, etc. And then creating interesting products and moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach, which was feedback that we had received from the process that has brought us here today. Goal 4 is our communications strategies. This was an important thing for both board and staff to look at. So using doing more community outreach during COVID, but also using our tools available to get out the word to, you know, underrepresented communities for home ownership, et cetera. Exploring how we can use our partners either through an advisory panel or something to share best practices and receive ongoing feedback, doing more marketing and business development, and then strengthening our brand, figuring out what CHFA's brand has been and how we would want to re-envision ourselves. Who are we going into the future, and what tools should we be using to deliver that message? Who is the message being delivered to, and getting that out there. Goal 5 is administrative processes. We got a lot of feedback about this. So reviewing our current policies to clarify our role versus perhaps DOH's role in a process, and using that to align ourselves better with DOH, and using our policy development to also inform our program implementation. Using more feedback from the public on a regular basis, and allowing for more ways of incorporating public input into changes in process, changes in forms, etc. Streamlining the application process, looking at ways that we can make both single and multifamily processes easier, faster, less expensive overall. And finally, our organizational capacity. We're doing a lot. We're trying to do more. How do we meet that demand? I think this is kind of, to me, is one of the more important steps we have to go through to actually strengthen our leadership, make sure we have the right people in the right jobs, and if there's any remediation of skill sets that has to happen, going through training programs, providing succession planning for departments that may have individuals that could be on the cusp of retirement, finding ways to talk about social and economic inequities in society, that CHFA, through its work, can help bring about more parity in the housing market in the work that it does, and how CHFA staff can collectively and individually respond to bring greater degrees of parity through its work. With that, I will stop and ask for your feedback.
Hey, this is Anne. I'm a little bit concerned going through this about a disconnect between the values that we just went through, and I thought we had a good discussion in terms of adding some values that were important to the board, and then the goals and strategies. The strategies seem to align with the goals, but I'm not sure how you get from the values to the goals, and whether we're losing something there, because we have these values, and we just talked about inclusion being an important value for the board. And then how do we get that to an action item like a strategy? It seems to just stall out at a value, and then there's no associated goal or strategy to make it actionable.
And this is Gwendolyn Thames. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I would just take it a step further, because I think for me, what was kind of missing, just to further that point, was, you know, how do you quantify this, right?
Right.
How do you have kind of measurable outcomes and targets, right, that we can work towards, right?
So can I respond to that really quickly?
Sure.
So the next step, this is actually sort of just high level thinking, and these are all just ideas. These don't have to be what we end up actually having as our strategies. These are ideas. What we would envision happening after this meeting would be to convene groups of board members and staff members for each of these goals, provided that we agree these are the goals. And again, you know, Anne's comment is well taken, and we can certainly address that. If we agree that these are the goals, we would convene small groups of board and staff, and we would then hammer out the action plan related to each of the goals, which would include the metrics, responsibilities, and timelines, which will allow us to either toss stuff out that we can't measure or create strategies that can actually be measured for each of those goals. So, I mean, I get your point, but I think we actually have to take the next step to get there.
Okay, so then I would just go back to what I said. I think before we start to look at each individual goal, if we're going to break up into groups to look at each individual goal, I think that we need to have goals that reflect the values. And I think maybe there's some things missing there.
Sounds to me like a goal that addresses the diversity and inclusion values and interests of this board is something that you would like us to help formulate. Is that right?
I would.
Okay. So maybe a few other voices on that. If there's support for that, we can certainly start to frame that with the idea, as Nanthony indicated, that over the next couple of months we would now dig into, so what does that mean? How would we actually go about more specifically addressing that goal? But is that one of the directions that you would like this plan to focus on?
Yes, I think, Ted, in supporting Anne's comment, we need to tie it up, and as we have a vision, how do we that incorporate into our goals? So you guys can think about how we can incorporate it and connect all the dots. I think it will help. Thank you.
This is Lisa. I'd like to offer one thought on that. And Glenn, I don't know if this is what you had in mind, but I want to go back to a comment from Melvin Colon about Hartford, where we have significant concentrations of poverty, concentrations of affordable housing, and the challenging but important question of, is there a role for CHFA in helping to pull back to communities like that a mixed income level of housing and residency that would help lift up those communities. So that's the sort of thing, I think that's where my mind starts to go, just as a thought. And I do want to thank you for all the hard work on this. These are always difficult processes. I wanted also to offer one sort of specific comment on Goal 5. It's, I think, important what you've stated there about finding a way to work more carefully together with DOH, but I'd also like to flag the opportunity of thinking more broadly about whether we can coordinate more closely and simplify the process with regard to other resources. We have a lot of different resources that developers apply for in a lot of different channels, and other communities have streamlined that better. I would note New York, for one, state of Massachusetts as well has done some work in this regard, so that with one application, you can potentially access several resources, or at least these processes are more connected than I think they are for us. So I would just flag that. One that comes to mind is the Green Bank. There are resources at the Green Bank that we talk about, but that are not directly connected, at least to my knowledge, to our process. And it would be simpler for developers, I think, and there are others on this call who would have good opinions about that, but there could be an opportunity to connect those dots more closely so that those resources are in more of a one-stop shopping type of approach.
Thank you.
Noted. Thank you, Lisa.
I have a comment on goal number 2. I was thinking maybe instead of having it sort of a short-term goal related just to COVID-19, maybe a broader goal that sort of addresses being nimble and, you know, our ability to respond to disaster. because we know other disasters are coming,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
And actually, you know, we are looking in ways that we can continue to support our, you know, as we transition back into the office over the next several months or few months, whatever, we have to find a way to continue to work partially remotely. And so there might be things that we're doing on that end, but I certainly agree with you that it's more than just how do you work together? How do you, you know, what is that really, from a business perspective, how do you continue to keep that level of flexibility and nimbleness, to your point? Because this kind of thing will continue to happen, and you know, in a number of different ways. So I agree. We can certainly make that a little bit broader in its reach. Thank you.
And maybe even reference it in the values as well, in the sense that this is how we will work. We will work in a nimble way, in a flexible way, in a responsive way to whatever it is that we might need to confront.
This is Kylie. I just wanted to add on the diversity and inclusion, and I'm happy to work more on this with Ian or anyone else who wants to. I think it's one thing to say, you know, diversity and inclusion are part of our values. I think it's another thing to be more specific about how that's going to be achieved. And one of the things to consider would be talking about actively desegregating. I know that's probably not a conversation that folks were having a month ago, but I know that it is a conversation that's happening now with legislators and others in the housing, land use, and zoning policy space. And I do think we're going to see some changes there. But I think it's something we need to consider is what is, everyone needs to consider what's our role in looking at the state as one of the most segregated states in the nation, and how do we dismantle that? And part of that is creating more opportunity and higher opportunity areas, but I think actively promoting desegregation may be something we want to consider adding to that, whether it's in the exact verbiage or in our own methodology, but being very clear about how it is we intend to tackle inclusion and diversity.
Thank you.
This is Gwendolyn. What is the time horizon for this plan? Like, is this, you know, a 3-year plan, a 5-year plan, a 2-year plan? Like, have we thought about, you know, recognizing that no plan is kind of, you know, they're all kind of living, breathing documents, right? As we should always think about a strategy, because there's always things that, you know, happen, and you need to be nimble and be able to pivot when the environment changes or what have you. But I'm just curious to know kind of how we're thinking about this from a strategy and a time horizon perspective.
Yeah, we've been thinking about this as a 3-year plan, Glenn, and goal 2 was meant to be a response to some concerns from board members last week about having a more short-term plan in place for responding to whatever needs are arising as a result of COVID. But the plan itself has a 3-year time frame.
We have suggested within that time frame, you will, as a board, I think, want to review the plan on a yearly basis and make some adjustments based on the progress you've made or the challenges you've confronted or new developments that have happened. In fact, I think early on, Anthony, I mentioned to you that maybe strategic plans ought to be better referred to as dynamic guides because of how fast and how much things change. So yes, we're taking this on as a 3-year challenge, but for this plan to be the most useful, we are highly recommending that you regularly review it, at least annually, and update it with changes that are necessary based on what you've discovered as you try to implement this plan and what has changed in the world since you adopted it. You probably can't wait 3 years before you make some mid-course corrections.
Thank you. Just one other note, because I apologize. I have to get on a call with the governor at 3 o'clock, so I'm going to have to drop. But just from a priorities and goals perspective, I'm just curious to understand how we are, I know I asked the question earlier about like how we're measuring these, in a quantifiable way, but I'm just wondering too what the role from a strategy and goal perspective, the prioritization of data collection plays, right? And making that kind of a central enabler that informs our work, because without understanding, what the market is, right? And where the gaps are, particularly when you're talking about underserved communities, and we want to be intentional about diversity and inclusion, we need to have good data, right? To support that and inform the investments that we make.
So we do have a housing needs assessment that we conducted and was completed in late 2019. We have just started to dig into it as we've started doing this work on the strategic plan. I don't think it's the only source of data we're going to have moving forward, but it is a tool that we believe will help us analyze the availability of units in different income ranges, as well as the needs analysis in different markets. It's a little bit of a different analysis. It uses a markets typology as opposed to a strict census tract or geographic framework for the analysis. It was meant to be a tool for CHFA to decide or to determine how best to deploy its resources, using basically a market as a stand-in for determining what sorts of housing might work best in certain areas based upon their characteristics of economic activity and opportunity, which are the two sort of pillars that define what a market looks like. So to answer your question, I think we have this one tool. It's not the only tool. We've got a whole data group. Diane has works with a number of folks in planning and data and research. So as we embark on this work, we envision that we would be able to harness other data sources or do the research to figure out what we need in order to build the programs we're interested in seeing. So Diane, I don't know if you want to say anything else about that.
Sorry. No, actually, I think you covered most of it. The nature of the markets of the housing needs assessment is a little different, and we're really hoping to be able to use that in combination with the QAP and other data sources to inform investment strategies and the highest best use of resources as opportunities come up.
This is Sarah Sanders. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I'm using two devices here, one for visual, one for audio. Anyway, I'm hearing a lot of discussion about diversity and inclusion. And to me, that phrase, it's been around a long time, kind of refers more to hiring or workforce. And I kind of think what we're talking about is stronger. We might want some stronger language like social justice and equality in serving underserved racial groups and access to housing. Something a little bit bigger than just diversity and inclusion, which I think is a somewhat tired phrase.
Thank you.
So in terms of next steps, unless there are more questions, what we will do is take all of your feedback today. We'll go back and redo this document. And once we fix it based on your feedback today, we will send you the final version and ask for your sign off, your general approval of what we have here. And then from there, we'll look for your participation, your interest in areas that you might have particular passion or expertise in, to help us frame the particular action items, timetables, responsibilities, etc., related to each goal and the accompanying strategies. Does that sound like a decent plan?
Yes. Nandini, it's Tim Hodges. I just, a couple of things here. One, I want to echo Lisa's comments, which is thanks for all the work that you guys did on this. Certainly useful and needed.
Tim, can you get a little closer to the microphone?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. The one thing that I would say, and what I said, Nandini, was thanks for all the work you guys have done on this. But to someone else's point earlier, it was difficult, at least for me, and I'm probably the only one. But trying to connect the notes that were done, the analysis and the priorities, and then the goals that we put together, particularly given the votes that we had last week, was difficult for me to connect all those with what we finally came up with in terms of goals. And I believe you saw Jared's email. I thought he brought up some pretty interesting points. So I'm not suggesting we need to do this today, but I do think there needs to be some discussion and explanation around how we connect all these, because it's not really based on what we talked about last week, all completely clear to me. I do believe you guys have put together a good document. I think there's some great points in there. I hear, listen to all the points that people made. It's never going to be perfect. It's about execution more than it is words on a piece of paper. But I do, at least for me, believe that it's going to be important to connect all those dots so that I feel comfortable moving forward and improving. And I don't feel that right now.
Okay.
I would like to acknowledge that one area that we as your consultant team missed, I believe, is the good conversation you had about when you had urban and non-urban. Yes, it is true that you do want to see more opportunities created in non-urban, high opportunity areas. And it is also true that you want to ensure that the older housing, the older stock, can get recaptured in the urban settings as well. And I'm not sure we captured that in the policy priorities as well as we might have. So that would be one area where I think there was a disconnect. I think otherwise, pretty sure that what we've identified did reflect pretty well the discussion. You are one area of maybe some further discussion that you might want to engage in is exactly how much involvement you would like CHFA to have beyond its traditional financing function. There were a lot of calls for CHFA to step into, lean into the policy arena, and some of the priorities you've talked about today, for example, helping to promote desegregation, would suggest that you would like CHFA to move in that area. There are others, a smaller group on the board, who would prefer the CHFA just stick closer to its knitting. It's what its traditional function has been, and really focus on doing that real well. So you don't have 100% consensus on that, but there was an overall sense we picked up that you would want to lean more into policy involvement than historically might have been the case. And so we can reopen that a bit and see if there are other thoughts, maybe ways in which we might be able to bridge those two views.
Ted, this is Tim Hodges again. I mean, I think I agree with you based on the vote, right? But if you kind of look at that question, the conversation that we had last week, you can get very different opinions on that, right? There's a difference between what I think there's a difference between what people were talking about today, which in terms of our policies and what we do in terms of reducing, whether it's desegregation or being more socially conscious versus being a lobbyist in Hartford. And I think, you know, depending on what tack you take on that, you have very different views.
Sure.
So Commissioner, do you want us to take a look at the this question about the financing authority role and being the best we can be in that sort of space versus leaning more into policy, and where will that take us? Do you want us to explore that a little more? Because that seems to be
I mean,
yeah.
for a couple of things that we do need to take in consideration is that the CHFA is the finance authority and it has a purpose. The production, the finance of housing, which yes, we have to make sure that it is strategies, goals that we have to come out with. Where do we want to invest? How do we want to invest? Risks that we want to take, and how do we bring other partners so that we can leverage those resources? Not the same as the state, where the state is the policy making and then working together with CHFA. I think that the CHFA's role should be a secondary on that, being there and help us out, but not the primary role. The primary role is basically to be the investment organization that can provide that financial support to basically carry on the goals of the state.
I agree with Selah on that. But again, if you go back and look at that question, if someone were to look at that question alone, and you've got 73% saying we should be a trusted convener and active public policy advocate, I think you get a very different perspective.
Lisa, I think you're on mute. You were. Oh no, she's not talking to us. Anyway, how much time do we have, Nandini?
So I think we're losing a couple people at 3 o'clock, or we may have already lost her. But we have until as long as you need. I mean, you know.
I mean, if any other board member has any other comments on what we were just talking about.
Yeah, this is Kylie. I'll just jump in. I don't disagree with you, Commissioner. I think that overall the policy direction of how the state wants to create and generate affordable housing policy should be an approach that we're all behind as collectively as possible, from the administration and DOH to CHFA, that we're sort of following the same general goal and roadmap. But I also think we can't ignore the fact that the QAP is its own policy document, and it's a policy statement. And what is in that QAP drives a tremendous amount of development. And what DOH uses as guidelines for their program drives the development, and that every program rubric that we put out tells developers this is how we want to see affordable housing developed in the state of Connecticut. So whether we want to or not, we're actively developing policy with that QAP alone, if not with every other piece of protocol around funding that we're doing. And so if we're all going to be marching to the beat of the same drum, whether that's in the case of, desegregation or, what have you, whether we're deciding, light remediation is part of our policy, whatever it is, it's great if it's uniform, but I also think we can't ignore the fact that this is already a policy creating body. We're in the driver's seat of a huge volume, millions and millions of dollars of funding, and by virtue of that, we are directing the way policy or housing is developed in the state. And it's hard to get away from that, I think. And I think we need to look at the role that CHFA has been playing in that. Is that, are we doing what we want? Are we happy with the product we created? Is it achieving the results for residents that we want, or for cities that we want? And make choices about that. And those choices are in effect making policy. So I know it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem, and I don't know that we need to get into it here, but I do think that, whether it's been intentional policy making, CHFA is a policy making body, and it's better, I think, to acknowledge that and embrace it and work alongside state partners than to. And I don't think this is what you're suggesting, Commissioner, but
because I'm absolutely. I said that is part of it, but it's within in a relationship with our financing piece that we have to. So it's not our primary role. CHFA shouldn't be the primary. That shouldn't be the primary role of the finance authority. Of course, it has to be part because many of the programs that we run dictate, and that's where we need to make sure that those goals align with policies for the state.
This is Tim again. Kylie, I agree with everything that you just said, as well as Selah. I was making the point though that what you just indicated, while it's completely accurate, it's very different than what we talked about and what the question is and what the vote was. I mean, this says seen as a trusted convener in active public policy, and that's the difference. Absolutely, we impact public policy with the QAP, but that's very different from being an active convener and being up on at the state capitol actually lobbying.
Yeah.
Can we rewrite that in a way that actually reflects the conversation that's being had right now? Because I'm hearing it, and I can see where not everyone, but a few board members are coming out, and that to me it's a very different place than where we were going before.
Yeah, we can take a look, Nandini and Ted. We should actually make sure that we take a look at that and rephrase it in a couple of instances so that we can align those things.
Because this is Carla, just to pick up. So Tim, I think you're hearing convener as something that's sort of a lobbying thing, whereas like CHFA being the table to convene some of these policy discussions is probably a good role for us in the context, as you're saying, of the governor's policy and the statewide policy. So convening doesn't necessarily mean lobbying. It can mean being a place to figure out how those policies get enacted among the groups that need to be brought together.
Any other comments on this topic?
Hi, this is Kathy.
Kathy.
Yeah, I would just second sort of what Carla and Kylie were saying, is that the advocacy doesn't mean to necessarily be lobbying, but convening the group to review the QAP is advocating for policy in a way. And is there a way to do that even more so, not just with rental housing, but on the single family side? Because I feel like that's the opportunity to create wealth for people. And I feel like if you really want equity, it comes down to building wealth.
Okay. Lisa, were you going to make a comment?
Thank you, Commissioner. Just very quickly, just a further thought that I would contribute, and this circles a little bit back to George's comments at the top of this meeting. I think when we think about those policy implications, there is an importance to how we think about each project. And we've had some discussions in the mortgage committee about the fact that sometimes we think, here's a project and here's how much each unit costs. And sometimes it's important that we're building a project in a specific area. Maybe there were additional costs, but we were paying those additional costs because of the value of building a certain type of project in a certain community and the impact in a wider sense. So I think this thinking could and should roll back to the way we evaluate each project that we're looking at. So I just wanted to contribute that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And I think that goes with the conversation that we have. And if people have some time, maybe we can just have another 10, 20 minutes, which is about building and continue the investment in the neighborhoods in the cities and building in the suburbs, which is another debate. Or some people will think one is higher than the other one, the priorities, and I think both have valid options in the neighborhood. And I'm just going to say briefly about the neighborhoods because Ted, you mentioned to conserve or to preserve those units that have been built in the neighborhoods, but it's not only that, it's how can we look at a neighborhood in a comprehensive, holistic approach where if they're building rentals, there is also opportunities, as Kathy said, for homeownership, but there is also room to bring the educational piece and to bring the health piece. So this comprehensive approach where we could support some of that work. And then the building in the suburbs or some communities of opportunities, as we have defined some of them, is also how do we incentivize, because it's a little more difficult sometimes to build, not only because of zoning, many times we say it is zoning, but it's also because the infrastructure is not there. And especially as you're building rental housing, you need to have the infrastructure not only to build, but to manage those units and to manage well so that they preserve and homeownership too. So those are two trends of thoughts, and I would like to hear some of that. No takers?
I'll take you up on it. It seems like, I mean, housing is such a good opportunity for people in general. And it always seems like discussions are one method over another, but it really should be about choice, right? I mean, there are people who would choose to live in an urban area, and there are others who would choose to live elsewhere. And it feels like we should meet people where they choose to live and help them achieve that goal.
But Kathy, at the same time, I think you make a good point, but, and I'm sorry, because we talked about this a little bit at the last convening. We also have the goals of reducing carbon footprint and having transit-oriented development. And so we need to think in that larger context. If we build more houses in the suburbs of Connecticut, we are contributing to more people driving cars. I mean, that's just a fact. Maybe we still do it, maybe, but maybe we have to think about that. We're not going to see quickly more dense public transportation across the eastern half of the state. When we build houses in those communities, there's a certain set of repercussions. So I think we just have to think about all of those things and not fall into the trap of saying, well, we'll just sprinkle the resources and do a little bit of everything. I think we just need to be very, a little bit more deliberate about those additional implications.
Yeah, this is Kylie. You've all heard most of what I've had to say on this topic, and I can talk for hours on it. I agree with Lisa 100% on the avoiding sprinkling, which I think is a little bit of what's happened with housing funding in the state, and being more deliberate. And I think part of determining our values and missions is about helping to determine how we're going to be deliberate and in what way. As many of you know, I come to this from a sort of interesting background, which is having been a tax credit attorney on the investor side for several years, having been an affordable housing advocate and also in the homelessness space, and then also having worked for the city of Hartford, heading up the development office there. So I've worked on this from several different angles. The thing that I will say that I don't know that has been discussed before that I think is worth noting and considering for CHFA moving forward is the effect that, well, I think there's been this overwhelming theme for many years amongst the Affordable Housing Development Committee that developing affordable housing is developing communities, and taking a vacant lot and turning it into affordable housing is something positive. Or again, the mentality, this is a blighted building that's never going to get developed by anybody else due to the financial nature of real estate in this neighborhood or in this city. And I think it's easy to look at that path and think that this is this is how we should be doing it because it's the option. And I would challenge us to think more broadly about the role that CHFA plays. In other words, are we a revitalization and community development group, or is that what we want to do? Is our primary goal developing quality, affordable housing that has positive implications for the residents? And maybe there are other tools that we can use for some of those other challenges that we've been talking about here, like blighted buildings. There's land banking. There's other things that I don't think the state has been really as invested in that could be other tools to deal with some of the challenges. Boosting home ownership, I think, is a great focus in urban areas. And the last thing I'll just say is when it comes to concentrating affordable, deed-restricted affordable housing in neighborhoods and in cities, in the way that we've done it, there are market implications for that I think CHFA really needs to consider. And I will say that one of the primary market implications I've seen is when you have neighborhoods that are 40, 50, 60, in the case of Hartford, almost 70% deed restricted housing, it becomes the predominant type of housing in that neighborhood. And the surrounding real estate responds to that. So in several neighborhoods in Hartford, the affordable rental rates are higher than the market rental rates. We've run into that with multiple projects in that area. But what that means is that landlords that don't have, that own property, that don't have access to the same resources that someone tapping into CHFA or other public resources has, is that they're competing at a disadvantage. And I think that what I've seen is that you have landlords, in particular in Hartford, that have real estate that's inexpensive, but expensive to maintain and expensive to get into, but expensive to maintain. It's the highest taxes in the state. You've got older housing stock. You've got building codes that are hard to keep up with when the buildings are old. And they're the older, sort of crappier housing stock compared to often the nicer, newer affordable housing property in the neighborhood. And so those private landlords simply can't compete with that. And so you end up with this inverse where they can't, if you read Alan Malik, who did a great I-Form for the partnership, read some of the works he's done about sort of the financial implications of this, you end up with, again, landlords who just get out or walk away from properties because the numbers just don't work. And I think when you see disinvestment in the quality of housing, when you see in particular neighborhoods, I think we have to, as an organization, as a financing entity, look at not just what does this neighborhood need? People want choice in this neighborhood. They want a nice housing product, but what does that mean for the market? What are we doing for the housing market in this area? And I think that there are, you can take this further and further and talk about, okay, what are the businesses that are going to survive in a neighborhood where 68% of the housing is deed restricted? What businesses are going to come there? And I can tell you there are, places in Hartford with what you would consider prime real estate on main thoroughfares where you can't get a CVS or someone else to come or a grocery store, because they're going to drop a pin and run a market analysis and determine that they can't financially survive there. So I say all this just to say that I think the consideration of how we proceed in this area, I agree it's not an all or nothing thing. Transportation needs to be included. It is about choice, but for a long time we've provided a lot of choice in our urban areas and not a lot of choice outside of those urban areas. And it's part of the reason that we're so segregated. And there are challenges to that are going to cost more infrastructure. Someone mentioned is one of those. I think we need more funding for that. I just think there's a holistic thing that needs to be considered here beyond just should we do more here or should we do more there. It really is almost a neighborhood by neighborhood thing, and we need to be looking at the implications beyond the physical building we're building and who we're building it for, but sort of what's the ripple effect of that and what's the ripple effect we want it to have.
Kylie for president.
Speaking.
So just, and I'll make this quick. I mean, just given what Lisa said and what Kylie just articulated, I think, Sailor, for me, this is where CHFA, Department of Housing, and DECD, where they could really kind of work together, right? I mean, this is where what Kylie articulated is important, but should CHFA be the one kind of, in my mind, when you talk about economic development and Department of Housing, you're talking about kind of a master plan, and then CHFA can fill in there where the resources are needed in a lot of those areas. And that's where I see the disconnect sometimes between DECD, DOH, and then CHFA. And I think what Kylie, at least based on what you said, what I hear there is, look, we can do a lot of different things, but if we have to do the master plan, if you will, and try to figure all that out, it becomes much more difficult when we have two organizations, which I think probably has better access and more tools to get to that information so that we can all kind of work together. That's at least in my head.
No, you're right. And I will add another organization, DEEP. Any other comments? No, these are great comments. Nandini, you're on mute.
Even I felt great of that. So I'm wondering if it makes sense, and I hate to do this, but we've gotten so much wonderful feedback from all of you. I want to use it. I think I have some ideas. I really do think I can redo these goals, perhaps, having this conversation behind me today. It would be great if we could convene one more time. I hate to do that, but I don't think I'm going to get everybody on board unless we have one more eye to eye. So if we could do that, I'd really appreciate it. We'll maybe keep it to an hour. We'll try to hit all the stuff we talked about today in a way that mirrors the conversations of the last 2 times with all this feedback. I think we have enough. I really do.
So Nandini, let me do this. We can send an invitation and whoever can join. So we will welcome everybody, but if 1 or 2 cannot make it, then maybe you can send a couple of dates.
Yeah.
So that then whoever can make the meeting, whichever day has most of the participants, then we can take that one.
Okay. Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much. It has been a great conversation, great feedback. I think Nandini and Ted, you guys have a lot of information. We'll work together, and then are you gonna send them some documentation before the next meeting based on this? Okay, so you will receive a document and some revisions, and then we will have another meeting. But thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.